There is no sadder sight than a young pessimist, except an old optimist. I think it was Mark Twain who said that. It certainly sounds like the sort of thing he would have said. But is it the case that optimism is a folly, something we ought to grow out of? With all the terrible news this year, it's very easy to be negative about the state of the world. War in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, a government that changes its leader more often than Matt Hancock changes his principles. But for all that, and given that it's New Year's Eve, I thought it might be a good idea to take the optimistic approach, to focus on the positive outcomes of 2022, and there have been a few. First, let's start with the state of free speech in this country. Now, for a long while, our police force was routinely investigating citizens for non-crime. All it would take is for someone to call the police and say they had read an offensive remark on Twitter, and the person who tweeted it would suddenly be guilty of a non-crime hate incident, which would be recorded on their files, often without their knowledge. And this was serious because these records of non-crimes would show up in disclosure and barring service checks and prevent people from getting jobs. But 2022 was the year which saw the end of non-crime hate incidents. This was in no small part due to the efforts of Harry Miller from Fair Cop, who fought this all the way to the Court of Appeal. At first, the police ignored the ruling, but it looks like they won't be able to ignore the law forever. Chris Philp, the policing minister, has now explicitly said that he will be instructing all chief constables to stop recording non-crime. Definitely a step in the right direction. And although the government is still persisting with its draconian online safety bill, which has all sorts of perilous ramifications for free speech, at least this year they agreed to drop the legal but harmful clause. So this would have meant that social media platforms would have had a legal responsibility to remove content that wasn't against the law, but was considered harmful, whatever that means. The amendments to the bill have come about because of the work of a number of campaigners, not least Toby Young's brilliant Free Speech Union, a group that certainly deserves our support at a time when politicians seem to think that words can be a form of violence. This has also been a brilliant year for those of us who have tried to draw attention to the dangers of gender identity ideology, a movement that threatens the rights of women and gay people while posturing as progressive. And although the SNP has pushed through its gender self-ID laws, which will mean people can simply declare themselves the opposite sex without a medical diagnosis, a law that is doubtless open to exploitation, this isn't the end of the story. As a result of Nicola Sturgeon's intransigence, her total refusal to engage intelligently with people's concerns, and the SNP's insistence that putting male-bodied criminals in female prisons poses no threat whatsoever to vulnerable women, lots of people are now waking up to a problem of which they had been previously unaware. And thanks to the courage of feminists and public figures like J.K. Rowling, more and more are starting to understand that these activists who claim to be on the right side of history are, in fact, illiberal, regressive, and often the most vicious bullies of all. The SNP, for instance, thinks it's a good thing that single-sex rape crisis centres for women in Scotland are scarce, because they think it's a form of bigotry to exclude men who identify as women. Well, this year J.K. Rowling set up Byra's Place, a female-only centre for victims of sexual abuse. Another great step forward. And with the closure of the Tavistock, an NHS gender paediatric clinic that was fast-tracking confused children onto puberty blockers and surgery, and with the charity Mermaids finally being investigated by the Charity Commission, awareness is growing of just how reactionary gender identity ideology really is, relying, as it does, on outmoded stereotypes of men and women, and pushing the idea that being same-sex attracted is something to be ashamed of. With each of these little victories, we're essentially seeing the damage that has been done by culture warriors over the past decade gradually being remedied. Things will probably get a lot worse before they get better. No doubt future historians will look back on our time in bewilderment, wondering why it was that so many in positions of authority suddenly started calling for censorship of opinions they disagreed with, struggling to answer the question, what is a woman, and smearing decent people as racists, transphobes, and even fascists for holding views that the vast majority of the population share. But maybe 2022 will be seen as the year when society began to sober up from its temporary bout of dipsomania. And this year, we've also been reminded what true activism looks like. We've got so used to posh kids gluing themselves to motorways or works of art, or students at Oxford and Cambridge screaming about their victimhood in their plummy upper-middle-class accents, that maybe we've forgotten that activism can be an essential motor for actual progress. In Iran, Women have been taken to the streets, burning their hijabs and dancing in spite of the laws against such activity. When 22-year-old Mahsa Amini was killed in custody by the so-called morality police, the women of Iran decided they had had enough. And although attempts to overthrow the regime in Iran have usually been quashed in the early stages, this one looks like it might succeed. So, those are just a few positive moments from an otherwise difficult year. And I, for one, hope that 2023 ends up giving us even more reasons to be cheerful.